couple of times I used in the same sentence, actually in the same breath, that I used the word justice, and I used the word social together. In fact, I even said social justice. And so for some of us, we're like, oh no, what's going on? Well, we just need to understand that biblical justice, all right, is loving your neighbor. It's what loving your neighbor looks like in public. That's what treating others in the image of God looks like in public. And as Christians, we need to know that there's others in our culture that want to hijack. Yes, they want to hijack that beautiful and strong word of justice. You have Democrats and Republicans and other causes, and they want to hijack that word. And so, case in point. Like when you hear the word social justice, what are some of the things that come to your mind? Certainly, maybe with the number of people listening to this message, some of us could be like, I really don't know. I mean, I hear people talking about it. I just don't know. Some think, well, I think it's the government's attempt to redistribute wealth. All right, or you have maybe like more of a conservative vision of social justice. Would be like we need to get the government out, and so we got to give a lot of choices and resources so people can live the American dream. And others might say it's a political philosophy that says if somebody says I have a right to this, whatever it is, I have a right to that, then we should give them that right, even at the expense of a Judeo-Christian moral framework, right? So by the way, I don't mean any of that. And neither do people that I know that love Jesus and love His Word. When they think of social justice, they're not thinking that. What they're thinking of is like what loving your neighbor looks like in public. They think of the Hebrew word for justice, mishpat. And it's so intertwined with God's righteousness. Right? They can't be separated. And so when you see something in your workplace or in your neighborhood or in your culture, and it's wrong according to a standard, and that standard is God's righteousness, and you see it, and you're like, listen, I got to do something about that. I got to make it right. All right, that's biblical social justice. And so when I said social justice, did you think of yeah, that's what Esther talks about. That's the book of Nehemiah. Or did you think of something that was maybe been hijacked by a political party? Or truth be told too, it's like maybe I don't know because it's sometimes a taboo word. All right? And so maybe the church hasn't done a good job in explaining and teaching what biblical social justice is. Because remember, biblical justice always will have social implications. Now, I'm setting this up because we're going to see that a little bit today in Nehemiah. And so I wanted to do some groundwork here regarding the issue of justice. Of course, we live in a day that in some Christian circles, the word social justice is like a taboo word. It's a code word for your departing, you're moving away from the gospel. But hopefully, you've seen that we God's given us Esther and Nehemiah and Ezra as God's authoritative voice on His vision of shalom. You need all three. But the reality is there has been some churches that have moved away from Esther and Nehemiah and Ezra and this vision of God's shalom. So if you're listening and you're like, oh my goodness, what's all this talk, social justice? I'm not offended by that, but let me encourage you that not too long ago, in strong, solid Christ-centered churches, social justice was not a taboo word. It was a positive word. For example, here's a quote by an outstanding conservative theologian 45 years ago. His name was Dr. Carl Henry. He was born here in New York. He grew up here. When he died in 2003, the New York Times gave him a nickname of the brain of the evangelical movement. Another nickname of him was the dean of evangelical theologians, all right? So he is, as you think about the top, if you put it together, a top 5 list of conservative theologians, Dr. Carl Henry would be on that list. And he says this: social justice is not simply an appendage to the evangelistic message. It is an intrinsic part of the whole. Theology, get ready for this. Theology devoid of social justice is a deforming weakness of much present-day evangelical witness. Translation: you better know what biblical social justice is and is not, or it will affect the credibility of Jesus' church. Which actually was what was going on 45 years ago. The word justice was already beginning to be hijacked. And here Dr. Carl Henry is saying, listen, anyone who's listening, listen, it's a deforming weakness. If we let the word be hijacked, what the church needed 45 years ago was God's authoritative voice in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ezra. And I would also throw in the Old Testament prophets. They needed, like today, we need to hear clearly the voice of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. These are gifts to be received to help us to see our community flourish in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. I'll even say this. As we look at America and we see the confusion, we see the chaos, we see the dysfunction, all right? In part, not the whole part, definitely not the whole part, but in part, Jesus' church is paying the price. Why? Because they have neglected the message of Esther and Nehemiah and Ezra and the Old Testament prophets. And yet for us today, we can change. We don't have to let it see it go on. We can say, no, biblical justice has social implications. That is a beautiful thing. Our culture needs to understand what biblical justice is. Now, if I've piqued your interest,